Aegis, the divine shield. You're standing on a blood-soaked battlefield. Arrows rain down like deadly hail. Swords flash in the merciless sun. And then you see it. A shield so terrifying that warriors freeze mid-strike, their courage evaporating like morning mist. This isn't just any shield. This is the Aegis. And what's mounted on its surface will haunt your nightmares forever. Picture ancient Greece. Not the white marble paradise you see in movies, but a world drenched in blood, ambition, and divine fury. Gods walk among mortals. Heroes challenge fate itself. And in the hands of the most powerful beings in existence, there's a weapon so devastating that its very presence can turn the tide of cosmic wars. The Aegis. You've probably heard the name before. Maybe you've seen it in a video game or caught a reference in a Marvel movie. But I guarantee you don't know the real story. Because what I'm about to share with you today goes deeper than any textbook, any Hollywood adaptation, any surface-level mythology video you've ever watched. We're going to explore the true origin of the Aegis. We're going to uncover why this shield was so terrifying that it could literally petrify enemies where they stood. We're going to reveal the dark secrets of what, or who, powered this divine weapon. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why the Aegis represents something far more profound than just a piece of ancient armor. This is a story of power, of protection, of a line between mortal and divine that should never be crossed. And it all begins with a question that ancient Greeks whispered in fear. What happens when gods need to be afraid? My name's here to guide you through one of mythology's most iconic and misunderstood artifacts. And before we dive deep into the blood-soaked origins of the Aegis, let me tell you exactly what you're going to discover in this video. First, we're going to explore the true origin story of the Aegis. And trust me, it's not what you think. We'll uncover the cosmic battle that necessitated its creation and why Zeus himself needed a weapon that could instill divine terror. Second, we're going to reveal the shocking truth about what makes the Aegis so powerful. There's a reason this shield could turn mortals to stone, and it involves one of mythology's most tragic figures, a victim transformed into a weapon. Third, we'll trace the journey of the Aegis through multiple divine hands. Because here's something most people don't know. The Aegis wasn't always Zeus's weapon. Different gods wielded it at different times, and each bearer used it for very different purposes. Fourth, we're going to examine the symbolism behind this legendary shield, what it meant to ancient Greeks, and what it still represents in our modern world. Because the Aegis isn't just ancient history. Its meaning echoes through contemporary culture in ways that might surprise you. And finally, we'll explore the dark questions that the Aegis raises about power, protection, and the price both gods and mortals pay for safety. But here's what I need you to do. If you're fascinated by mythology, if you love diving deep into the stories that shaped civilization, if you want content that goes beyond the surface-level stuff everyone else is covering, hit that subscribe button right now. Because we're building a community of people who understand that these ancient stories aren't just entertainment. They're mirrors reflecting the deepest truths about human nature, power, and the eternal struggle between chaos and order. Now, before we can understand the Aegis, we need to go back, way back, to a time before Zeus ruled Olympus, to a war that would determine the fate of the cosmos itself. Are you ready? Let's begin. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the universe in its infancy. Not the ordered cosmos we know today, but a realm of primordial chaos. Titans, beings of unimaginable power, rule everything. These aren't the gentle giants of fairy tales. These are forces of nature made of flesh. Cronus, the Titan king, devours his own children to prevent a prophecy from coming true. The earth itself trembles at their footsteps. But prophecy, as the Greeks understood better than anyone, cannot be avoided. Zeus survives. Hidden away by his mother Rhea, He grows strong in secret, biding his time. And when he's ready, he returns to challenge his father. He frees his siblings, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, Hestia, from their father's belly. Together, they stand against the Titans in a conflict that would later be called the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans. And here's what you need to understand about this war. It wasn't a quick battle. It wasn't a single confrontation. This was a cosmic struggle that raged for 10 brutal years. Mountains were shattered. Seas boiled. The very fabric of reality strained under the weight of divine combat. The young Olympian gods were powerful, yes, but they were outnumbered. The Titans had ruled for eons. They knew the secret paths of creation itself. And Cronus, despite his paranoia and cruelty, was a formidable warrior king. Zeus needed an edge. He needed allies. He needed weapons. He needed something that would tip the scales in this apocalyptic conflict. So he descended into the darkest pit of creation, Tartarus itself, and freed beings that even the Titans feared. The Cyclopes, master craftsmen imprisoned in the depths, their single eyes seeing dimensions beyond mortal comprehension. And the Centimanes, the hundred-handed ones, whose rage at their imprisonment made them perfect allies against the Titans who had chained them. And here's where our story truly begins. The Cyclopes, grateful for their freedom and recognizing Zeus as the future king of gods, forged weapons of unprecedented power. For Zeus, they created the thunderbolt, lightning given form, power distilled into a weapon that could shake the foundations of the world. For Poseidon, the trident, a tool to command the seas and split the earth itself. For Hades, a helmet of invisibility, the ability to move unseen even by divine eyes. But Zeus needed more than offensive power. He needed protection. He needed a defense so absolute, so terrifying, that it would serve not just as a shield but as a weapon in itself. Something that would make his enemies hesitate, falter, break. The Cyclopes understood. They began forging something unprecedented. Not just armor, but a divine artifact that would embody protection itself. They wove together divine bronze, blessed by Zeus's own power. They infused it with the essence of invulnerability, with divine authority, with the weight of cosmic law. They created the Aegis. But here's the thing about the earliest versions of the Aegis, and this is where the story gets really interesting. It wasn't yet the terrifying shield we know from later myths. In its original form, the Aegis was described more like a breastplate or protective cloak. Some sources describe it as a storm shield, capable of generating thunder and lightning, creating tempests with a shake. Ancient writers couldn't quite agree on what it looked like, which tells us something important. The Aegis was beyond mortal description. It existed at the edge of human comprehension, a divine artifact that couldn't be fully captured in words. But what everyone agreed on was its effect. When Zeus wore the Aegis into battle, the tide of the Titanomachy shifted. Enemies who had stood firm against thunderbolts faltered when they glimpsed the Aegis. Some accounts describe it as blazing with divine fire. Others say it emanated an aura of such concentrated power that it was physically painful to look upon. The Titans, for the first time, felt something they'd never experienced before. Fear. Not just concern, not just caution, but primal, existential terror. The recognition that they faced something beyond their ability to comprehend or counter. And with the Aegis protecting him, Zeus led the Olympians to victory. The Titans were defeated, bound, and cast into Tartarus. Cronus was overthrown. The age of the Olympians began. But the Aegis? Its story was just beginning. Because the weapon that had helped Zeus win the war would evolve into something even more powerful, even more terrifying. And that evolution would require a sacrifice so dark, so tragic, that it would forever change the nature of the Aegis itself. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand something crucial about Greek mythology. The gods weren't static. They evolved. They adapted. And their weapons evolved with them. The Aegis that emerged from the Titanomachy was powerful, yes, but it would soon become something else entirely. Something that wore a face. A face that could turn flesh to stone. Now we need to talk about Medusa. And I know what you're thinking. You've heard this story before. The monster with snakes for hair. The gaze that turns people to stone. Killed by the hero Perseus. But let me tell you something. Almost everything you think you know about Medusa is wrong. Because Medusa wasn't born a monster. She made one. And her story is one of the most heartbreaking tragedies in all of Greek mythology. A story about violation, transformation, and how victims are turned into villains. Let's start at the beginning. Medusa was one of 3 sisters called the Gorgons. But unlike her siblings, Stheno and Euryale, Medusa was mortal. She was also, according to ancient sources, breathtakingly beautiful. Her beauty was so renowned that it attracted attention from across the ancient world. She served as a priestess in Athena's temple, devoted, faithful, pure, and that's where her nightmare began. Poseidon, god of the seas, saw Medusa in Athena's temple and desired her. And because Greek gods rarely took no for an answer, he violated her right there, in the sacred space dedicated to the virgin goddess Athena. Think about that for a moment. Medusa was in a place that should have been the safest sanctuary in the world, serving a goddess who was supposed to protect her. And she was assaulted by one of the most powerful gods in existence. What happened next reveals something dark about the Greek understanding of divine justice. Athena, discovering that her temple had been defiled, was furious. But instead of punishing Poseidon, because you don't punish one of the major Olympians without starting a divine war, she punished Medusa. Let that sink in. The victim was punished for being victimized. Athena transformed Medusa into a creature so hideous that anyone who looked at her would turn to stone. Her beautiful hair became a writhing mass of serpents. Her lovely face became a horror. Her gaze became a weapon that brought instant death. Some scholars interpret this transformation differently. They suggest that Athena was actually trying to protect Medusa, giving her the power to defend herself so that no one could ever hurt her again. That the stone-turning gaze was a gift, ensuring that any man who looked at her with desire would be destroyed. But here's the truth. Whether punishment or protection, Medusa was forever transformed from a person into a thing, from a woman into a weapon, from human into monster. And this is where her story intersects with the Aegis. After her transformation, Medusa fled to the edges of the world, to a desolate place where she could harm no one. She lived in isolation, surrounded by the stone statues of those who had tried to find her, their faces frozen in eternal horror. She became a legend, a cautionary tale, a monster. And then Perseus came. You probably know the broad strokes of this story. Perseus, the son of Zeus, was challenged to bring back Medusa's head by King Polydectes, who wanted to get rid of the young hero. It was supposed to be an impossible task, a death sentence disguised as a quest. But Perseus had divine help. Athena gave him a polished shield that he could use as a mirror, allowing him to see Medusa's reflection without meeting her gaze. Hermes gave him winged sandals for speed. Hades loaned him his helm of invisibility. Armed with divine weapons and divine guidance, Perseus infiltrated Medusa's lair while she slept, and he cut off her head. Think about that moment. Medusa, who had already been violated, transformed, and exiled, sleeping fitfully in her isolation. And a young hero, equipped by the very gods who had failed to protect her, creeps up and decapitates her. But here's where the story takes a turn that most retellings gloss over. When Perseus severed Medusa's head, 2 beings emerged from her neck: Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a giant with a golden sword. These were the children she'd been carrying since Poseidon's assault, trapped inside her transformed body all that time. Even in death, Medusa was still being used, still being violated. Her body is still not her own. Perseus took the head and discovered that even severed, it retained its power. The gaze still turned living things to stone. He used it as a weapon, defeating his enemies by showing them Medusa's face. And then he did something that would forever change the nature of the Aegis. He gave Medusa's head to Athena. And Athena, the goddess who had transformed Medusa in the first place, the goddess whose temple had been the site of Medusa's assault, the goddess who had helped Perseus kill her. Athena took that severed head and mounted it on the Aegis. The divine shield that had helped Zeus win the Titanomachy now bore the face of a victim. The Aegis, already a symbol of divine protection and power, became something even more fearsome. Because now it didn't just represent Zeus's authority or Athena's wisdom. It carried the literal, physical presence of Medusa's curse. Anyone who looked upon the Aegis now faced Medusa's gaze, and that gaze turned flesh to stone. The shield that had been forged by Cyclopes, blessed by Zeus, tested in the war against the Titans. Now it was empowered by trauma, by violation, by the transformation of a victim into a weapon. And this is what makes the Aegis so much more complex than a simple magical artifact. Because embedded in its mythology is this dark truth: the most powerful protection comes from weaponizing suffering. The shield that defends the gods is powered by the face of someone they failed to protect. Athena wore the Aegis into battle, Medusa's face upon her breast or shield, and enemies would falter. Some from fear of Athena's power, but others from the recognition of Medusa's tragedy. A reminder that the gods' justice is not always just, that their protection comes at a terrible price. The Aegis had become more than a shield. It was a statement, a warning, a reminder that divine power is built on foundations of suffering, and that even the gods will use the broken and the violated to maintain their authority. But here's something most people don't know. The Aegis didn't stay with Athena forever. In fact, it passed between divine hands, and each bearer used it differently, revealing different aspects of its power. And understanding who wielded the Aegis, and when, and why, that reveals layers of meaning that most mythology videos never touch. So let's talk about who actually got to use the Aegis. Because this isn't like Thor's hammer, with its whole worthiness enchantment. The Aegis moved between gods based on need, context, and the complex power dynamics of Olympus. And each bearer revealed something different about what the Aegis actually represented. Zeus, the Aegis as authority. First and foremost, the Aegis belonged to Zeus. It was created for him, empowered by him, and represented his ultimate authority as king of the gods. When Zeus wielded the Aegis, it wasn't primarily a defensive weapon. Zeus didn't need protection in the conventional sense. He was the most powerful god in existence. Instead, the Aegis served as a symbol of his right to rule. Ancient sources describe Zeus shaking the Aegis to create storms. He'd hold it aloft and thunder would crack across the sky. Clouds would gather. Lightning would strike. The Aegis became an extension of Zeus's dominion over the weather itself. But more than that, the Aegis represented cosmic order. Zeus used it to enforce divine law, to remind both gods and mortals of the hierarchy that kept the universe functioning. When Zeus appeared bearing the Aegis, it wasn't a threat, it was a statement. I am the law. I am the power that maintains reality itself. Think about that for a moment. The shield that could turn you to stone wasn't primarily about individual combat. It was about maintaining the social and cosmic order. One look at the Aegis, one glimpse of Medusa's face, one flash of its divine radiance, and you remembered your place in the universe. This is power as a social construct, power as communication. The Aegis didn't need to actually be used in combat, because its very presence established Zeus's dominance. Athena, the Aegis as wisdom. But Zeus wasn't possessive about the Aegis. He frequently loaned it to his daughter Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. And when Athena wielded it, the Aegis meant something entirely different. Athena was Zeus's favorite child, born from his own head, fully formed and armored. She embodied the intellectual, strategic side of warfare, not the blind rage of Ares, but calculated, purposeful combat. She was the goddess soldiers prayed to before battle, asking not just for strength, but for the wisdom to win without unnecessary bloodshed. And the Aegis became an extension of that philosophy. When Athena wore the Aegis, usually described as either mounted on her shield or worn as a breastplate, it represented the ultimate defense. Not just physical protection, but the immunity that comes from being untouchable through superior strategy. There's this fascinating passage in Homer's Iliad where Athena uses the Aegis in battle. She doesn't attack with it directly. Instead, she holds it up, and the sight of it causes panic among her enemies. They scatter. They flee. They lose all coordination and become easy targets for the Greek forces. This is psychological warfare at its finest. Athena understood that the greatest victory is the one that doesn't require fighting at all. The Aegis, in her hands, became a tool of wisdom, using fear to achieve strategic objectives without bloodshed. And remember, Athena's Aegis bore Medusa's face. Every time she used it, she carried that complicated legacy. The goddess who had transformed Medusa now wielded her power. Some scholars see this as a kind of posthumous vindication. Medusa's gaze, which had isolated her in life, now protected civilization in death. Others see it as a continuation of Medusa's exploitation, her image used without consent for purposes she never chose. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Greek mythology is rarely simple. Apollo, the brief borrower. Here's something most people don't know. In some accounts, Apollo also briefly used the Aegis. Now, Apollo wasn't typically associated with the Aegis. He was more known for his bow and arrows, his lyre, his connection to prophecy and healing. But during the Trojan War, according to some versions of the myth, Zeus allowed Apollo to borrow the Aegis, and Apollo used it to terrify the Greeks. See, Apollo was on the Trojan side during the war. He favored Troy, protected its people, and actively fought against the Greek forces. When he took up the Aegis, he used it to shake the foundations of the Greek fortifications. The divine shield, in his hands, became a tool of destruction, breaking walls, scattering armies, evening the odds in a war that the Greeks seemed destined to win. This reveals something important. The Aegis's power wasn't inherently moral. It didn't work only for good causes. It was a tool, and like any tool, its morality depended on who wielded it and for what purpose. Apollo's use of the Aegis reminds us that divine favor was fickle in Greek mythology. The same weapon that protected one city could destroy another. The same gods who blessed you today might curse you tomorrow. The Aegis in mortal hands? Now here's an interesting question. Did any mortals ever use the Aegis? The short answer is no. The Aegis remained firmly in divine hands. No hero, no matter how favored, ever got to actually wield it. Perseus carried Medusa's severed head, which had similar power, but the actual Aegis itself? That remained on Olympus. And I think that's significant, because the Aegis represented something that mortals couldn't access. Absolute authority, absolute protection, absolute power. Heroes could borrow divine weapons. Perseus got Hades' helm. Heracles used various divine gifts, but the Aegis remained out of reach. It was a reminder that there were limits, that some powers belonged only to the gods, that no matter how heroic you were, how favored, how accomplished, you were still mortal. And mortals don't get shields that can shake the heavens. The symbolism of shared power. But the fact that the Aegis moved between gods is itself meaningful, because it suggests that even among the Olympians, ultimate power wasn't hoarded, it was shared strategically. Zeus could have kept the Aegis to himself. He could have made it a symbol of his sole authority, never letting anyone else touch it. But he didn't. He loaned it to Athena regularly. He allowed Apollo to use it when necessary. This suggests a more nuanced view of divine authority than we often see in mythology. Yes, Zeus was the king. Yes, his word was law. But his power was maintained through strategic alliances, through sharing resources with his children and allies, through understanding that absolute tyranny is actually a position of weakness. The Aegis, moving between divine hands, represented a network of power rather than a single source. Zeus's authority was real, but it was maintained through cooperation, through distribution of his symbols and tools. This makes the Olympian power structure more interesting than a simple dictatorship. It was more like a divine corporation, with Zeus as CEO, but with real power distributed among key executives. And the Aegis was one of the resources that facilitated that distribution. Of course, Zeus could always take it back. That's important too. The Aegis always returned to Zeus. He was always the ultimate authority. But by loaning it out strategically, he maintained relationships, created obligations, and ensured that his children and allies remained invested in the Olympian system. Pretty sophisticated for a group of deities who supposedly spent most of their time seducing mortals and having petty arguments. But we're not done yet. Because to really understand the Aegis, we need to look at what it meant to the ancient Greeks themselves, how they understood its symbolism, how it shaped their view of power, protection, and the relationship between humans and the divine. And that's where things get really interesting. Imagine you're an ancient Greek, living in Athens around 450 BCE. You're standing in front of the Parthenon, that magnificent temple crowning the Acropolis, and you're looking up at the massive statue of Athena Parthenos that dominates the interior. She's 40 feet tall, covered in gold and ivory, holding a spear in one hand and a statue of Nike, goddess of victory, in the other. And there, on her chest, or her shield, depending on which artistic representation you're viewing, is the Aegis, with Medusa's face staring back at you. What did that mean to you? What thoughts went through your mind when you saw the symbol of divine protection bearing the face of a monster? The answer reveals something profound about how ancient Greeks understood power, protection, and the price of civilization. The Aegis as apotropaic magic. First, we need to understand the concept of apotropaic magic. Apotropaic comes from the Greek word meaning to turn away or to avert. It's magic designed not to attack, but to repel evil, to ward off threats, to protect through intimidation. And Medusa's face was the ultimate apotropaic symbol. Think about where you'd find Medusa imagery in ancient Greece. Not just on the Aegis, but everywhere. On shields. Yes, warriors would paint or emboss Medusa's face on their shields to frighten enemies. But also on doorways, protecting homes. On ovens and kilns, protecting craftsmen. On temples, guarding sacred spaces. Medusa's face, frozen in that moment of horror and rage, became a ward against evil. The logic was simple and powerful. If this face could turn you to stone, if this gaze could end your existence, then you'd better think twice about causing trouble. The Aegis, bearing Medusa's image, was the divine version of this widespread practice. It was the ultimate apotropaic device, not just warding off mortal threats, but representing the cosmic principle of protection itself. When you saw the Aegis on Athena's statue, you were reminded that Athens itself was under divine protection, that the city's patron goddess bore a weapon so powerful it could repel any threat, that you were safe. as long as you remained within the bounds of divine favor. The Gorgonean and civic identity. The technical term for Medusa's severed head as a symbol is Gorgonean. And in ancient Athens, the Gorgonean wasn't just a religious symbol, it was a civic one. Athens, more than any other Greek city-state, associated itself with Athena and by extension with the Aegis. The Athenians saw themselves as Athena's chosen people, protected by her wisdom and her power. And the Gorgonean became a symbol of Athenian exceptionalism. Think about it. Athens was a democracy, or at least a limited democracy for male citizens. It was a center of philosophy, art, drama, and intellectual achievement. It saw itself as more civilized, more enlightened than the warrior cultures of Sparta or the mercantile cities of Ionia. And yet, their patron goddess bore a weapon powered by petrification, by the face of a victim transformed into a monster, by violence and tragedy. This contradiction is at the heart of Greek civilization itself. Athens produced Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. It created democracy. It gave the world tragedy and comedy as art forms. And yet it was also an imperial power, subjugating other cities, enslaving populations, maintaining order through military force. The Aegis, with Medusa's face, represented that duality. Civilization requires protection. Order requires the capacity for violence. Wisdom must be backed by power, or it's just empty philosophy. The Gorgonean on the Aegis was a reminder that even in the most enlightened society, safety ultimately rests on the ability to turn your enemies to stone. Boundary markers and liminality. But there's another layer to this symbolism that's even more fascinating. In Greek thought, the Aegis, and especially the Gorgonean, represented boundaries. The line between civilized and wild, between order and chaos, between human and divine. Medusa herself lived at the edge of the world, in the liminal space between the known and unknown. She was transformed from human to monster, occupying a space between categories. Her gaze literally turned you from flesh to stone, from living to inanimate. She was a boundary personified, and when her face was mounted on the Aegis, it became a portable boundary marker. The Aegis defined the line between those under divine protection and those outside it, between those who respected divine authority and those who challenged it. Think about how Zeus used the Aegis. When he shook it to create storms, he was literally defining the boundary between sky and earth, between divine power and mortal experience. When Athena held it up in battle, she was creating a line that her enemies couldn't cross. Not a physical barrier, but a psychological and spiritual one. The Aegis made boundaries visible and enforceable. And in a world without clear maps, without established borders, without the kind of defined territorial sovereignty we take for granted today, the ability to create and enforce boundaries was civilization itself. The Aegis in ritual and worship. Now let's talk about how the Aegis functioned in actual Greek religious practice. We have records of various festivals and rituals where priests would wear or carry representations of the Aegis. These weren't the actual divine artifact, obviously, but symbolic recreations, usually shield-like objects decorated with the Gorgonean and other apotropaic symbols. During processions, especially military ones, priests would bear these Aegis replicas while invoking Athena's protection. The idea was that by displaying the symbol of divine protection, they were literally calling down that protection onto the city or army. This is sympathetic magic at work. The symbol doesn't just represent power, it participates in it. By displaying the Gorgonean, by carrying a representation of the Aegis, you're invoking the actual divine force that it embodies. And this wasn't seen as superstition by the ancient Greeks. This was sophisticated theology. They understood that symbols have power, that representation and reality aren't as separate as we modern people tend to think. That by engaging with the symbols of divine power, you're engaging with the power itself. When an Athenian soldier went into battle with a Gorgonian on his shield, he wasn't just trying to scare the enemy, though that was part of it. He was ritually connecting himself to Athena's protection, to the cosmic order that the Aegis represented, to the divine authority that backed Athens' military campaigns. He was making himself, in a small way, a bearer of the Aegis himself, the dark side of divine protection. But we can't talk about what the Aegis meant to ancient Greeks without acknowledging the darker implications. Because the Aegis, for all its protective symbolism, was also a reminder of divine cruelty, of how the gods treated mortals, of the price of safety. Every time someone looked at the Aegis and saw Medusa's face, they were reminded of her story. A priestess, violated in a sacred space, transformed into a monster, hunted down and killed. Her severed head was then used as a weapon by the same goddess whose temple had been the site of her assault. This wasn't a story with a happy ending. There was no justice for Medusa, no restoration, no redemption, just exploitation, transformation, weaponization. And the ancient Greeks knew this. The story was widely known. It wasn't hidden or suppressed. So what did it mean that their primary symbol of divine protection was powered by such a tragedy? I think it meant that the Greeks had a much more realistic view of power than we often give them credit for. They understood that protection comes at a cost, that safety requires violence, that order is maintained through the threat of force. The Aegis, bearing Medusa's face, was an honest symbol. It didn't pretend that divine protection was gentle or merciful. It didn't hide the violence inherent in maintaining civilization. It showed you the cost, and it dared you to look away. Philosophical interpretations. Later Greek philosophers, particularly the Neoplatonists, would reinterpret the Aegis in more abstract terms. They saw it as a symbol of divine reason or logos, the ordering principle of the universe. The Aegis represented the rational structure that held chaos at bay, that maintained the cosmos in its proper order. Medusa's face, in this interpretation, represented the petrifying effect of confronting pure divine truth. Mortals couldn't look directly at divine reality without being overwhelmed, just as they couldn't look at Medusa without being turned to stone. The Aegis, then, became a symbol of the necessary mediation between human and divine. Zeus and Athena could bear it because they were divine. Mortals needed representations, symbols, filtered versions of divine truth that wouldn't destroy them in the encounter. This is actually a pretty sophisticated philosophical position. It acknowledges that there are truths too powerful for human consciousness to process directly, that we need symbols, stories, myths to mediate our relationship with ultimate reality. The Aegis, in this view, wasn't just a weapon or a shield. It was a philosophical principle, the idea that some forms of knowledge and power must be approached indirectly through symbol and story, or they'll destroy us. Pretty deep for a magical shield with a monster's face on it, right? Now let's talk about what we can actually see, touch, and study. Because the Aegis isn't just a story, it left a physical mark on the ancient world. And by examining how ancient artists depicted the Aegis, we can understand how its meaning evolved and changed over time. The Archaic period, terror and power. If you look at depictions of the Aegis from the Archaic period, roughly 800 to 500 BC, what strikes you immediately is how terrifying they are. These early Gorgonians don't look human. They're grotesque, monstrous faces with bulging eyes, gaping mouths full of fangs or tusks, protruding tongues, and wild, serpentine hair. They're designed to shock, to frighten, to repel. On early vases and pottery, when artists showed Athena or Zeus with the Aegis, the Gorgonian dominated the composition. It wasn't a small detail, it was often the focal point, radiating lines of force or surrounded by snakes. This tells us something important. In the archaic period, the Aegis was primarily understood as a weapon of terror. Its protective power came from its ability to frighten and repel. The uglier, the more monstrous the Gorgonian, the more powerful the Aegis. There's a famous archaic relief from the Temple of Artemis at Corfu that shows a massive Gorgon, presumably representing the Aegis or at least the power of the Gorgonian. She's 10 feet tall, shown in the archaic running pose, flanked by her children Pegasus and Chrysaor. Her face is terrifying, almost comical in its exaggerated monstrosity. But here's what's interesting. Despite the terrifying face, the overall posture isn't aggressive. She's not attacking. She's just present. The terror comes from her existence, not her actions. This perfectly captures the archaic understanding of the Aegis. It doesn't need to attack. Its presence is enough. The classical period, beauty and horror combined. Move forward to the classical period, roughly 500 to 323 BCE, and something fascinating happens. The Gorgonian starts to become beautiful. Not completely, not entirely. But artists begin depicting Medusa with more human features. Her face becomes symmetrical, almost lovely. The wild monstrosity of the archaic period is refined into something more ambiguous. A face that's both attractive and disturbing. The most famous example of this is probably the Medusa Rondinini, a Roman copy of a Greek original from around 440 to 430 BCE. Medusa's face is serene, almost sad. Her hair is still snakes, but they're arranged almost decoratively. You can see the beauty she supposedly possessed before her transformation, but there's something unsettling in her expression, a hint of the horror beneath. Why the change? I think it reflects a shift in Greek culture itself. The classical period was the height of Greek philosophy, democracy, and artistic achievement. Athens was at its peak. Greek culture was becoming more sophisticated, more nuanced, more psychologically complex. And the simple monster of the archaic period no longer captured what they wanted to express about power and protection. By making Medusa beautiful as well as terrible, classical artists were acknowledging the complexity of her story. She wasn't born a monster, she was made one. Her face, even transformed, retained echoes of her former beauty, her former humanity. The Aegis, bearing this more complex Gorgonian, became a more philosophically interesting symbol. It represented not just brute terror, but the tragedy inherent in power, the cost of protection, the beauty destroyed in the service of safety. When you looked at Athena's statue in the Parthenon, that masterpiece by Phidias, the Gorgonian on her Aegis was probably closer to this classical ideal, beautiful and terrible at once, drawing your eye even as it repels you. This is art operating at the highest level, not just representing a myth, but exploring its psychological and philosophical dimensions. The Hellenistic period, drama and emotion. In the Hellenistic period, roughly 323 to 31 BCE, after Alexander the Great's conquests had spread Greek culture across the known world, artistic depictions of the Aegis became even more dramatic. Artists of this era loved intense emotion, dynamic composition, and psychological depth. And when they depicted Medusa, they emphasized her suffering. There's a famous Hellenistic sculpture of Medusa's head that shows her in her death moment. Mouth open in a final scream, eyes wide with terror and pain, snakes writhing in genuine agony. It's heartbreaking and horrifying at the same time. This reflects a Hellenistic cultural interest in pathos, in suffering, in the emotional intensity of tragic moments. The Aegis wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was a window into a specific, terrible moment of cosmic injustice. Artists were forcing viewers to confront what the Aegis actually represented. Not an abstract principle of protection, but the weaponization of a victim's suffering, the transformation of a person into an object. This is arguably the most honest depiction of what the Aegis means. And it's notable that it came from the Hellenistic period, a time when Greek culture was questioning its own foundations, grappling with the legacy of imperial expansion, dealing with the reality that the clear certainties of the classical period had given way to a more complex, more morally ambiguous world. The Roman period, appropriation and adaptation. When the Romans conquered Greece and absorbed Greek mythology into their own culture, they also adopted the Aegis. But they used it slightly differently. Roman depictions of the Aegis, usually on statues of Minerva, the Roman equivalent of Athena, tend to be more martial, more explicitly military. The Gorgonian is often more stylized, more decorative, less psychologically complex than Greek versions. This makes sense. The Romans were building an empire. They needed symbols of divine military might. The Aegis, as a weapon of terror that protected civilization, was perfect for their purposes. But something was lost in translation. The Romans generally didn't engage with the tragic complexity of Medusa's story the way the Greeks did. For them, the Gorgonian was simply a powerful symbol, apotropaic magic that worked. The deeper philosophical and ethical questions that Greek artists explored, not as central. There are exceptions, of course. Some Roman poets, particularly Ovid, engaged deeply with Medusa's story, emphasizing her victimhood. Ovid's version of the myth in his Metamorphoses is actually our most detailed ancient source for the rape and transformation narrative. But in terms of visual art, Roman Aegises tend to be more straightforward: scary face, protective power, military might. End of story. Archaeological evidence. Now, beyond artistic depictions, we also have archaeological evidence of how the Aegis functioned in ancient Greek society. Excavations at temples, particularly those dedicated to Athena, have uncovered numerous votive offerings featuring Gorgonians. Small shields, breastplates, even jewelry, all decorated with Medusa's face. These weren't just decorative. They were offerings to the goddess, prayers for protection rendered in physical form. By dedicating a Gorgonian to Athena, you were essentially saying, "Please extend your Aegis's protection to me." We've also found Gorgonians used as boundary markers. Carved stones with Medusa's face would be placed at the edges of sacred precincts, at city gates, at thresholds between public and private space. Again, this reflects the apotropaic function. The Gorgonian, representing the Aegis, marked protected space. It said, "Beyond this point, you are under divine law. The Aegis's power extends here. Behave accordingly." There's even evidence of Gorgonians being used in more mundane contexts, on grain storage facilities, on water sources, on craftsmen's tools. The logic was that if the symbol could protect cities and temples, it could protect your grain from rodents and your tools from breaking. This widespread use tells us something important. The Aegis wasn't just a mythological abstraction. It was a living symbol that permeated daily life, that people encountered constantly, that shaped how they understood protection and danger. Modern discoveries. And we're still finding new evidence. Archaeological excavations in Greece continue to uncover new depictions of the Aegis, new contexts for understanding how it was used and understood. In 2018, excavations near the Acropolis uncovered a workshop that apparently specialized in creating small replicas of the Aegis, miniature shields with Gorgonian decorations that were probably sold to pilgrims visiting Athena's temple. This tells us that there was actually a commercial market for Aegis symbols. People wanted to take home a piece of that divine protection, and craftsmen were happy to provide it, for a price. It's a reminder that even in the ancient world, religion, mythology, and commerce were intertwined. The sacred and the mundane weren't separate spheres. The Aegis protected you in battle, yes, but it also protected your home, your business, your family. It was divine power made practical, cosmic authority rendered in a form you could hang above your door. And that's actually pretty remarkable, that a symbol could function on so many levels simultaneously, as cosmic principle, as military weapon, as civic identity, as personal protection, as commercial product. The Aegis wasn't one thing. It was all of these things, all at once. And that's what made it so powerful. So we've explored the ancient understanding of the Aegis, its origins, its bearers, its symbolism, its physical representations. But here's the thing. The Aegis didn't stay in the past. It's still with us today. In our language, our culture, our understanding of power and protection. And examining how the Aegis appears in modern contexts reveals how we've transformed, adapted, and sometimes misunderstood this ancient symbol, the Aegis in language. Let's start with the most obvious place, the English language itself. When we say something is done under the aegis of an organization or authority, we're directly invoking the ancient symbol. We're saying that action is protected, authorized, sanctioned by a higher power. The research was conducted under the aegis of the university. The peace talks proceeded under the aegis of the United Nations. What's interesting is that this usage has become so common that most people don't even realize they're referencing Greek mythology. The aegis has become a dead metaphor, a phrase that once had a vivid, specific meaning but now just means sponsorship or protection in a general sense. But the etymology is still there, lurking beneath the surface. Every time you use Aegis in this way, you're invoking Zeus's shield, Medusa's face, the cosmic principle of divine protection. Language carries these ancient symbols forward, whether we're conscious of it or not. Military applications. Unsurprisingly, military organizations have been drawn to the Aegis as a symbol and name. The most prominent modern example is the Aegis combat system, a sophisticated naval defense system used by the United States Navy and several allied nations. It integrates radar, weapons systems, and command and control into a comprehensive defensive network. The name is perfect, really. The Aegis combat system is designed to protect ships from missile attacks, from aircraft, from various threats. It creates a defensive shield around naval vessels, a technological version of Zeus's divine protection. And there's something almost mythologically appropriate about naming an advanced defense system after a shield that could turn enemies to stone. Modern weapons systems are designed to neutralize threats before they can engage you, just like the original Aegis, whose mere presence could stop attacks before they began. But here's what's lost in this appropriation: the complexity, the tragedy, the ethical questions embedded in the original myth. The Aegis combat system is just technology. It's morally neutral, a tool used by whoever controls it. There's no Medusa on it, no reminder of the suffering that powers protection, no acknowledgement that safety comes at a cost. The modern military Aegis is all power, no tragedy. And I think that's a significant loss, because the ancient Aegis forced you to confront the ethical complexities of protection. The modern version lets you ignore them. The Aegis in comics and superhero culture. Comic books and superhero stories have embraced the Aegis enthusiastically. And this makes sense. Comics are modern mythology, stories about extraordinary beings with godlike powers struggling with human problems. DC Comics has featured the Aegis in various forms, usually as a divine artifact that grants protection or power to its bearer. The shield appears in Wonder Woman comics regularly, since Wonder Woman is explicitly connected to Greek mythology. She's an Amazon, blessed by the gods, fighting for justice in a mortal world. When Wonder Woman uses a shield bearing the Gorgonian, there's a direct mythological lineage. She's literally carrying forward the tradition of Athena, bearing the same symbol that protected ancient Athens. But And this is important. These comic book versions usually strip away the darkness of the original myth. Medusa, in most superhero contexts, is just a monster. Her victimhood, her tragedy, her transformation from person to weapon, that usually gets ignored in favor of the simple, cool factor. The Aegis becomes a power-up, a magical item, a weapon without moral complexity. There are exceptions. Some more thoughtful writers have explored the darker aspects of the Medusa myth, acknowledging her as a victim. But in general, pop culture tends to flatten these ancient symbols, keeping the surface appeal while discarding the philosophical depth. Marvel has been a bit more interesting with this. When they use Greek mythology, which they do regularly, with characters like Hercules and the Olympians appearing in various storylines, they sometimes engage with the moral complexity. There's a storyline where Medusa's sisters, Stheno and Euryale, seek revenge for what was done to their sister. They're portrayed sympathetically, their rage justified. The Aegis, in that context, becomes a symbol of divine injustice, a reminder that the gods are not always good. That power often comes from exploitation. That's closer to the spirit of the original myth. Video games and interactive media. Video games have absolutely run wild with the Aegis concept. And this makes sense. Games are about power, about acquiring tools and abilities, about becoming strong enough to overcome challenges. The Aegis appears in dozens of games, from God of War to Assassin's Creed to various Final Fantasy titles. Sometimes it's a literal shield, sometimes it's armor, sometimes it's a defensive ability or spell. God of War is particularly interesting because it actually engages with Greek mythology on a deep level. The game doesn't shy away from the violence, the moral ambiguity, the fundamental cruelty of the gods. When you encounter references to the Aegis or to Medusa in these games, they're presented within a world where divine power is genuinely terrible and terrifying. The recent God of War games have moved to Norse mythology, but the Greek-focused earlier games treated the Aegis with appropriate weight. It wasn't just loot, it was a symbol of divine authority and cosmic power. Other games are less thoughtful. The Aegis becomes just another item in your inventory, stats and abilities divorced from meaning. You equip it because it has better defense ratings, not because it represents anything philosophically significant. But even when games treat it superficially, they're keeping the symbol alive in cultural memory. Millions of gamers know the word Aegis, even if they couldn't tell you the full mythological story behind it. And that matters, because familiarity with these ancient symbols, even in degraded form, creates potential for deeper engagement later. Academic and intellectual contexts. The Aegis has also been embraced in academic and intellectual contexts as a symbol for protective or defensive frameworks. In philosophy, you sometimes see references to the Aegis of reason or the Aegis of logic, frameworks that protect thought from error or irrationality. This draws on the Neoplatonic interpretation of the Aegis as representing divine reason protecting the cosmos from chaos. In psychology, particularly Jungian and archetypal psychology, the Aegis has been analyzed as a symbol of the protective aspects of the psyche. Carl Jung himself wrote about the Gorgonian as representing the petrifying encounter with the unconscious, the idea that confronting certain psychological truths can temporarily freeze you, turn you to stone, before you can integrate and move forward. This is actually a really sophisticated reading. It preserves the core meaning of the original myth, that some encounters are so powerful they can paralyze you, while translating it into psychological terms. In feminist discourse, Medusa, and by extension the Aegis, have become powerful symbols. Feminist scholars have reclaimed Medusa as a figure of female rage, of justified anger at patriarchal violence. The Gorgonian becomes not a symbol of terror but of resistance, the refusal to be victimized, the transformation of trauma into power. This reinterpretation is controversial, but it's engaging with the myth at a level most pop culture doesn't bother with. It's asking, what does it mean that our primary symbol of protection is a victimized woman's face? What does it mean to weaponize suffering? Can that weaponization be reclaimed by those who suffer? These are the questions the ancient Greeks were grappling with too. So in a way, this academic and intellectual engagement is actually closer to the spirit of the original myth than the simplified pop culture versions. Corporate and commercial uses. And then there's the commercial appropriation of the Aegis. Dozens of companies have Aegis in their names, usually companies offering protection, security, or defense services. Aegis Insurance, Aegis Security Systems, Aegis Cybersecurity. The logic is obvious. The name suggests protection, authority, and vulnerability. It's reassuring to customers who want to feel safe. But stripped of all mythological context, these commercial uses reduce the Aegis to pure branding. It's a word that sounds impressive, that carries vague associations of strength and safety, but that's disconnected from any deeper meaning. This is probably the furthest degradation of the symbol. The Aegis becomes pure marketing, an empty signifier, a way to charge more for services by wrapping them in mythological gravitas. And yet, even this keeps the word alive. Even this maintains some connection, however tenuous, to the original myth. The question of cultural appropriation. Now we need to address an uncomfortable question. Is the modern use of the Aegis cultural appropriation? Greek mythology isn't a living religious tradition in the way that, say, Native American spiritual practices are. There's no community of Greek pagans who feel their sacred symbols are being misused. But there is a question about taking ancient symbols out of context, stripping them of meaning, using them purely for commercial or entertainment purposes without understanding or respecting their original significance. I don't have a definitive answer here, but I think it's worth considering. When we use Aegis to mean corporate sponsorship, when we slap it on a video game shield as a random power-up, when we reduce it to a military designation, we're benefiting from the accumulated cultural weight of the symbol while ignoring the complex, often dark meanings that gave it that weight. Is that appropriation? Or is that just how culture works? Symbols evolving, meanings shifting, ancient stories finding new life in new contexts? I lean toward the latter, but I think we have a responsibility to understand what we're using, to know the full story, to recognize that the Aegis isn't just a cool name or a convenient symbol. It's a myth that ancient people created to grapple with deep questions about power, protection, and the price of safety. And when we use it, we're stepping into that conversation, whether we realize it or not. Now we need to go deeper. Because the Aegis isn't just a mythological artifact or a cultural symbol. It's a lens through which we can examine fundamental questions about human nature, society, and the relationship between protection and power. So let's put on our philosopher hats and really dig into what the Aegis means on a conceptual level. The paradox of protection. The Aegis embodies a fundamental paradox. To be protected, you must be willing to terrify others. Think about this carefully. The Aegis doesn't protect through impenetrability. It's not described as unbreakable armor that simply deflects attacks. Instead, it protects through deterrence, through psychological warfare, through instilling such fear that attacks don't happen in the first place. This is the logic of modern nuclear deterrence, actually. Nations don't build nuclear weapons primarily to use them, but to ensure they never have to, because the threat of mutually assured destruction prevents conflict. The Aegis operated on the same principle. You don't attack Zeus because one glimpse of the Aegis might literally petrify you. You don't challenge Athena because facing the Gorgonian on her shield means confronting something that can end your existence in an instant. Protection, in this model, doesn't come from walls or barriers. It comes from the credible threat of overwhelming retaliation. But here's the dark side. This kind of protection requires you to be terrifying. It requires you to maintain and display weapons of such power that others fear to challenge you. It requires you to be willing to use those weapons, or at least to convince others that you're willing. The Aegis, bearing Medusa's face, is an honest symbol of this reality. It doesn't pretend that protection is gentle. It shows you exactly what backs up divine authority, the ability to turn your enemies to stone. And that raises uncomfortable questions. How much of what we call peace is actually just controlled terror? How much of what we call protection is really about threatening others into compliance? The Aegis forces us to confront these questions. The weaponization of suffering. But there's an even darker dimension to the Aegis. It's powered by victimization. Medusa was assaulted, transformed, hunted, and killed. And then her severed head, the physical manifestation of her trauma and transformation, was mounted on the Aegis and used as a weapon. This isn't incidental to the myth. It's central. The most powerful protective symbol in Greek mythology is literally a victim's face. What does that mean? One interpretation is that it reflects an uncomfortable truth about how societies achieve security, by transforming victims into deterrents, by making examples of people, by saying, "Look what happened to this person. This is what happens when you cross us." The Aegis, in this reading, is a warning. Medusa's fate, violation, transformation, death, and weaponization is what awaits those who disrupt divine order. Even if you're a victim, even if you're innocent, even if you were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, you can be transformed into a tool of power. That's a terrifying message, and it's one that resonates throughout human history. How many victims have been turned into symbols, into warnings, into deterrents? How many people have suffered not just the original violation, but the additional indignity of having their suffering weaponized? The Aegis makes this dynamic explicit. It doesn't hide the violence. It displays it proudly, forcing everyone to see what powers divine protection. Another interpretation, more charitable to the Greeks, is that the Aegis represents the transformation of trauma into power. Medusa, who was powerless in her victimization, becomes in death a source of protection for others. Her gaze, which isolated her in life, now defends civilization. There's something almost redemptive in this reading. Medusa's suffering wasn't meaningless. It became the foundation for cosmic order. But I'm skeptical of this interpretation, because Medusa never chose this. She didn't volunteer to become a weapon. She didn't consent to her image being used this way. Her agency was violated in life, and it continued to be violated in death. And that's what makes the Aegis such a morally complex symbol. It's effective, yes. It provides genuine protection. But that protection comes at a cost that the protected never pays. Only the victim does. The psychology of the Gorgonian. From a psychological perspective, the Gorgonian on the Aegis is fascinating. The face that turns you to stone if you look at it directly. What does that represent psychologically? Freudian analysts have had a field day with this. Freud himself wrote about Medusa as representing castration anxiety, the fear of emasculation. The petrifying gaze, in his interpretation, represents the paralyzing terror of confronting sexual difference and vulnerability. I'm not sure I buy that interpretation entirely. Freud had a tendency to reduce everything to sexual anxiety, but there's something there about the fear of being frozen, paralyzed, rendered powerless. Jungian psychology offers a different take. Jung saw the Gorgon as representing the shadow, the dark, repressed aspects of the psyche that we can't confront directly without being overwhelmed. The petrifying gaze is what happens when you face your shadow too suddenly, without preparation. You freeze. You can't integrate what you're seeing. You're psychologically turned to stone. The Aegis, in this interpretation, is the gods' ability to weaponize the shadow. They can bear the Gorgonian because they're divine. They have the strength to confront and contain what would overwhelm mortals. This actually makes a lot of sense mythologically. The gods regularly do things that would be psychologically devastating to mortals. They transform, they kill, they violate, they reshape reality. They can bear the weight of these actions because they're gods. The Aegis, bearing the face that mortals can't look upon, represents that divine capacity to contain what humans can't. More recent psychological work has focused on the Gorgonian as representing trauma itself. The face frozen in horror, the petrifying gaze. These are images of a traumatic freeze response, of being so overwhelmed that you can't move, can't react, can't process. Medusa, transformed by trauma, becomes the physical embodiment of that traumatic freeze. And when her face is mounted on the Aegis, trauma itself becomes a weapon. This is uncomfortably close to reality, isn't it? Trauma does have power. People who have been traumatized often develop a presence that others find unsettling. They've seen something, experienced something that others haven't. They carry knowledge that's painful to confront. The Aegis, bearing Medusa's traumatized face, weaponizes that presence. It forces others to confront trauma indirectly, at a distance, just as Perseus used a mirror to see Medusa's reflection rather than looking at her directly. And this suggests a function for myth itself, to allow us to confront difficult truths through symbol and story, to face trauma and terror and moral complexity at one remove, through the safe distance of narrative. The Aegis isn't just a symbol within the myth. It's a symbol of what myth itself does. It mediates between truths too terrible to face directly and our need to understand them. The ethics of divine power. All of this raises profound ethical questions about power, authority, and protection. The gods, bearing the Aegis, claim the right to protect civilization. But their protection comes at a cost that they don't pay. Medusa pays it. The enemies turn to stone to pay for it. The mortals who live in fear of divine power pay it. Is that just? Is that right? The ancient Greeks didn't shy away from these questions. Their tragedies are full of moments where divine justice is interrogated, where characters question whether the gods are actually good or simply powerful. And the Aegis, I think, is one of those symbols that invites that interrogation. When you see the Aegis and recognize what powers it, a victim's face, a woman's trauma, a person transformed against her will into a weapon, you have to ask, is this the kind of protection we want? Is this the kind of order we want to live under? Some would say yes. Order, safety, civilization, these require a strong hand. They require the willingness to use overwhelming force. They require symbols that remind everyone of the consequences of challenging authority. The Aegis, in this view, is simply honest about what maintains peace. Better a terrifying symbol that prevents violence than actual violence carried out repeatedly. Others would say no. Protection built on victimization, order maintained through trauma, safety purchased by weaponizing suffering. These are forms of violence themselves. They might be necessary evils, but they're still evils. And maybe, these critics would argue, we should be looking for other models. Other ways of creating safety that don't require mounting a victim's face on a shield. I don't have an answer to this debate. I don't think the Greeks did either. That's why the myth is so powerful. It doesn't resolve the tension. It forces you to sit with it. Every time an ancient Greek saw the Aegis on Athena's statue, or on a soldier's shield, or above a doorway, they were confronting this ethical complexity. They were being asked, implicitly, is this the price of safety? Are you willing to pay for it? And that question is still relevant today. When we build weapons systems and name them Aegis, when we create security states and surveillance networks, when we justify violence and control in the name of protection, We're operating in the same ethical territory that the ancient Greeks were exploring. The Aegis forces us to acknowledge what we'd often rather ignore. That protection comes at a cost, and that cost is often paid by the vulnerable, the victimized, the powerless. The Aegis as mirror. There's one more psychological dimension worth exploring. The Aegis as a mirror. Remember, Perseus defeated Medusa by using a polished shield as a mirror, looking at her reflection rather than directly at her. And this image, the shield as mirror, connects directly to the Aegis itself. What does it mean that divine protection functions as a kind of mirror? In one sense, it means that the Aegis shows you yourself. When you face the Gorgonian, when you confront that terrible visage, you're seeing a reflection of your own capacity for violence, your own potential to be both victim and victimizer. The Aegis doesn't just threaten you, it shows you what you could become. Medusa was human once, beautiful, innocent, faithful, and she became a monster, not through her own fault, but through circumstances beyond her control. That could be you. The Aegis, as mirror, says, civilization is a thin veneer. Trauma can transform anyone. Divine power can reshape you into something you never chose to be. And that's why it's so terrifying. Not because it's alien or monstrous, but because it's familiar. Because it shows you a truth about human vulnerability that's almost unbearable to acknowledge. In another sense, the Aegis as a mirror suggests that protection is ultimately about self-confrontation. To be safe, you must be willing to see yourself clearly, including the parts of yourself that are terrifying, that are monstrous, that you'd rather deny. The gods can bear the Aegis because they can look at Medusa without flinching. They can acknowledge the violence, the tragedy, the ethical complexity of what powers their authority. Mortals turn to stone because they can't. They can't bear to see what civilization actually rests on. They can't confront the truth about power and protection. The Aegis, in this reading, is a test. Can you look at the truth without being destroyed by it? Can you bear witness to the suffering that underwrites safety? If you can, you might be worthy of wielding the Aegis yourself, metaphorically speaking. If you can't, you'll be paralyzed by the encounter, turned to stone by a truth too heavy to carry. The Aegis isn't unique in world mythology. Cultures across the globe have created symbols of divine protection, often involving terrifying or monstrous imagery. By comparing the Aegis to similar symbols from other traditions, we can understand both what's universal about this kind of mythological thinking and what's distinctively Greek about the Aegis specifically. The evil eye, cross-cultural apotropaic magic. Let's start with the evil eye, one of the most widespread apotropaic symbols in human culture. From the Mediterranean to the Middle East to South Asia, cultures have believed in the evil eye, the idea that malicious glares or jealous looks can cause harm. And to protect against the evil eye, they've created eye symbols. The logic is similar to the Gorgonian. You fight looking with looking. You counter the evil eye with a protective eye that stares back, deflecting malice before it can reach you. The Nazar, the blue and white concentric circle eye symbol you see throughout Turkey and Greece and the broader Mediterranean region, operates on this principle. It's meant to draw the evil eye's attention, to absorb malicious intent before it can harm you. This is the same apotropaic logic as the Aegis. The scary thing protects you by confronting threats directly, by being more intense, more powerful, more visually arresting than whatever threatens you. But there's a key difference. The evil eye symbols are generally passive protection. They ward off ambient malice. The Aegis, by contrast, is active. It doesn't just deflect harm. It can petrify, destroy, actively attack. The Gorgonian is more aggressive, more weaponized than most evil eye symbols. It's not content to simply turn away threats. It annihilates them. This reflects something about Greek culture specifically. Their understanding that protection and aggression aren't separate. that the best defense is often a terrifying offense. To be safe, you must be capable of overwhelming violence. Kali, the terrifying divine feminine. In Hindu tradition, the goddess Kali presents an interesting parallel to the Aegis and the Gorgonian. Kali is often depicted with a terrifying appearance: dark blue or black skin, wild hair, a garland of skulls, a belt of severed arms, her tongue protruding, blood dripping from her mouth. She's the goddess of destruction, of time, of death. And yet, she's also a protective figure. Devotees pray to Kali for protection against evil, against demons, against threats to cosmic order. Sound familiar? Like Medusa, Kali is a terrifying feminine face that repels evil. Like the Aegis, her frightening appearance is what makes her powerful as a protector. But there are important differences. Kali is a goddess in her own right, not a victim transformed into a symbol. Her terrifying aspect is self-generated, an expression of her divine power, not something imposed upon her. And in Hindu devotional practice, Kali's terrifying appearance is understood as a kind of teaching. She destroys ego, destroys attachment, destroys the illusions that cause suffering. Her frightening aspect is actually compassionate. She's helping you confront difficult truths about impermanence and the nature of reality. The Aegis has some of this philosophical dimension, as we discussed earlier, but it's not primary. The Aegis is more straightforwardly martial, more about power and authority than about spiritual teaching. Still, the parallel is striking. Both traditions understand that the divine feminine can be terrifying, and that this terror can be protective, even compassionate in its own way. Norse mythology, terror as divine attribute. In Norse mythology, we don't have a direct parallel to the Aegis as a specific artifact, but we do have the concept of terror as an attribute of divine warriors. The berserkers, warriors who fought in a trance-like rage, supposedly immune to pain and fear, were said to strike terror into enemies just by their presence. They didn't need special weapons. Their very state of being was enough to cause panic. This is similar to how the Aegis functions. It's not just a physical object providing protection. It's a psychological weapon that operates through the effect it has on observers. The Norse tradition also has powerful apotropaic symbols, like Thor's hammer Mjolnir, which was worn as an amulet for protection. But Mjolnir is a more straightforward symbol. It's a weapon wielded by a god, and wearing its image connects you to Thor's protective power. The Aegis is more complex because it includes Medusa's face, because it carries that tragic backstory, because it forces you to confront the cost of protection. Norse mythology tends to be more straightforward about violence and power. It's a warrior culture's mythology, where strength and courage are celebrated without as much ethical ambiguity. Greek mythology, by contrast, at least in its more sophisticated forms, is constantly interrogating power, questioning authority, examining the ethical dimensions of divine action. The Aegis reflects that complexity. Mesoamerican traditions, shields, and divine symbols. In Aztec and broader Mesoamerican traditions, shields were incredibly important both practically and symbolically. Aztec warriors carried elaborate shields decorated with feathers, paint, and symbols representing their patron deities. These weren't just protective equipment. They were spiritual objects that connected the warrior to divine power. The Aztec deity Huitzilopochtli, for example, carried a shield called the Serpent Shield, decorated with eagle feathers and serpent imagery. In some depictions, this shield had a face on it, not unlike the Gorgonian on the Aegis. The logic is similar. The shield doesn't just physically protect, it carries divine power. It displays symbols that have spiritual force. It connects the bearer to cosmic authority. But Aztec shield symbolism tended to emphasize solar imagery, eagle and serpent motifs, connections to warfare and sacrifice. The focus was different from the Greek Aegis, which emphasized the petrifying gaze, the power of terror, the weaponization of a victim's image. Still, the parallel shows us something universal. Across cultures, shields are more than just defensive equipment. They're canvases for expressing cosmic principles, for displaying power, for connecting mortal warriors to divine authority. The shield is a liminal object. It sits between you and the world, between your body and threats to it. And that liminal position makes it perfect for bearing symbols that mediate between human and divine, between mortal and cosmic. The Aegis is the ultimate expression of this universal human tendency to make shields into sacred objects. Japanese traditions, the yokai and protective masks. In Japanese folklore and tradition, we find interesting parallels in the yokai, supernatural creatures, often terrifying, that can be protective or destructive depending on context. And more directly relevant, Japan has a long tradition of using frightening masks for protection. Demon masks, oni masks, fierce deities. These are displayed to ward off evil, to protect homes and temples, to mark sacred boundaries. The logic is pure apotropaic magic. The scary face protects you by frightening away threats. This is very close to how the Gorgonian functions. And in fact, when Japanese culture first encountered Greek mythology during the Meiji period, the Gorgonian was immediately understood within the context of their own apotropaic mask traditions. The universality is striking. Humans everywhere, independently, have come to the conclusion that displaying a terrifying face can protect you from harm. But again, the Aegis has that additional layer. It's not just a scary mask. It's a specific victim's face. It carries a story. It forces you to confront the ethics of protection. Japanese protective masks are more archetypal, more abstract. They represent fearsome power in general, not a specific tragedy transformed into a weapon. The Aegis is more narrative, more morally complex. And that's distinctively Greek. What makes the Aegis unique? So what have we learned from this comparative analysis? The apotropaic function of the Aegis, scary face provides protection, is universal. Cultures worldwide have independently developed this logic. The use of shields as sacred objects, as bearers of divine symbolism, also widespread. Even the specific motif of a face or eyes providing protection appears in multiple traditions. But what makes the Aegis unique is its narrative complexity, its ethical ambiguity, its insistence on telling the story of Medusa alongside the symbol of her face. Greek mythology, more than most mythological traditions, is interested in interrogating power, in examining the cost of civilization, in asking uncomfortable questions about divine justice. And the Aegis embodies that distinctive Greek approach. It's not content to be a simple symbol of protection. It insists on complicating that protection, on showing you what it costs, on making you confront difficult truths. The Aegis says, yes, this protects you. But look at what powers that protection. Look at whose suffering makes you safe. Look at the violence embedded in order. And that's what makes it such a powerful, enduring symbol, not despite its ethical complexity, but because of it. Now let's get really contemporary and examine how the Aegis relates to modern political and social theory. Because the questions the Aegis raises about protection, power, authority, and the relationship between safety and violence are questions we're still grappling with today. Sovereignty and the monopoly on violence. Let's start with one of the foundational concepts in modern political theory: sovereignty and the state's monopoly on legitimate violence. The sociologist Max Weber famously defined the state as the entity that holds a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. In other words, the government is the only institution that can legally use violence. Police, military, prisons, executions. And this monopoly on violence is what provides order, what allows society to function. Without it, you have chaos, warlordism, and constant conflict. Sound familiar? The Aegis represents exactly this principle. Zeus, as king of the gods, holds ultimate authority, and that authority is backed by his possession of weapons like the Aegis and the thunderbolt. His power isn't just moral or philosophical. It's the capacity for overwhelming violence. And that capacity is what maintains cosmic order. The Aegis is sovereignty made visible. It's the threat of violence that backs up divine law. When Zeus shakes the Aegis, he's reminding everyone that cosmic order is maintained through his power, his capacity to enforce his will. But here's the critical parallel to modern political theory. That monopoly on violence, that sovereign authority, is supposed to protect citizens. That's its justification. We accept that the state has the power to imprison, to execute, to wage war, because that concentrated power protects us from worse violence. The Aegis represents the same bargain. Divine authority is terrifying, yes, but it protects mortals from the chaos that would exist without it. Better to live under Zeus's rule, under the shadow of the Aegis, than to face the alternative, a world without order, without protection, without divine law. But, and this is crucial, both the Aegis and modern sovereignty rest on a foundation of violence. The protection isn't gentle or peaceful. It's backed by the credible threat of force. And once you see that parallel, you start seeing the Aegis everywhere in modern politics. Every military parade is a display of the Aegis, a reminder of the state's capacity for violence, meant to reassure citizens and deter enemies. Every police uniform, every court proceeding, every law on the books, these are manifestations of sovereignty, of the monopoly on violence that maintains order. And like the Aegis, this concentrated power raises ethical questions we often don't want to confront. We want to believe that law and order arise naturally, peacefully. But they don't. They're maintained through force, or the threat of it. The Aegis, with Medusa's face staring back at us, won't let us forget that. The security state and surveillance. Let's extend this analysis to the modern security state. After September 11th, Western democracies dramatically expanded their surveillance and security apparatus. More cameras, more data collection, more monitoring of communications, more security screenings, more police powers. All in the name of protection. All to keep citizens safe. And here's the thing. It works, to some extent. Terrorist plots have been foiled. Threats have been identified and neutralized. The security apparatus does provide some measure of protection. But at what cost? Privacy eroded. Civil liberties curtailed. Certain communities profiled and targeted. The pervasive feeling of being watched, monitored, assessed. And the implicit message of the security state is the same as the message of the Aegis. You are safe because we have the power to identify and neutralize threats. Don't look too closely at how we do it. Don't question the methods. Just accept the protection. The security camera watching you from above a street corner. Is that not a kind of modern Gorgonian? An eye that watches, that sees, that promises protection but also threatens? Behave, it says. We're watching. We can turn your life to stone, freeze your bank accounts, restrict your movement, detain you indefinitely, if we determine you're a threat. The parallel to the Aegis is uncomfortably precise. And like Medusa's face on the Aegis, the modern security state often targets and victimizes the very people it claims to protect. Muslim communities are subject to extra surveillance. Black and brown communities over-policed. Whistleblowers prosecuted for revealing state secrets. The vulnerable become scrutinized. The difference is suspected. Protection, once again, is built on a foundation of someone else's suffering. Nuclear deterrence and mutually assured destruction. We touched on this earlier, but it's worth exploring more fully. Nuclear deterrence is the Aegis logic applied to international relations. During the Cold War, both the United States and Soviet Union maintained massive nuclear arsenals, not primarily to use them, though the capacity was there, but to ensure the other side wouldn't attack. Mutually assured destruction, MAD, was the official doctrine. If either side launched a nuclear strike, the other would retaliate, and both nations would be annihilated. And perversely, this threat of total destruction kept the peace. The Cold War remained cold precisely because both sides possessed weapons so terrible that using them would mean their own destruction. This is the Aegis principle: protection through terror, safety through the threat of overwhelming force. And like the Aegis bearing Medusa's face, nuclear deterrence carries a dark irony. The weapons that keep us safe, that have prevented great power war for decades, are also capable of destroying civilization itself. They protect us while simultaneously threatening us. The Gorgonian that defends you can also turn you to stone. And there's another parallel. Nuclear deterrence requires you not to look too closely at the human cost. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, events that demonstrated the weapon's terrible power and established their deterrent effect, killed hundreds of thousands of people, most of them civilians. Just as Medusa's victimization powers the Aegis, these historical tragedies power modern nuclear deterrence. We don't like to think about it. We prefer to focus on the peace that nuclear weapons have supposedly maintained. But the cost is there, embedded in the symbol, just like Medusa's face is embedded in the Aegis. Social contract theory and Leviathan. The political philosopher Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 17th century, articulated a theory of the social contract that sounds remarkably like the mythology of the Aegis. In his masterwork Leviathan, Hobbes argued that in the state of nature, without government, without law, without sovereignty, human life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Constant war, constant fear, no security, no progress. To escape this nightmare, Hobbes argued, humans create a sovereign power, the Leviathan, and grant it absolute authority. They give up their individual freedom to do violence in exchange for the sovereign's protection. The Leviathan, like Zeus with the Aegis, maintains order through overwhelming power. It holds the monopoly on violence. And this concentrated power is what makes civilization possible. Hobbes wasn't naive about this. He knew the Leviathan could be tyrannical, could abuse its power. But he thought that was better than the alternative, a return to the state of nature, to chaos and constant war. Better the Aegis, even with Medusa's face upon it, than no protection at all. Modern political theory has largely accepted some version of this logic. We grant the state enormous powers to tax us, to conscript us for military service, to imprison us if we break laws, even to execute us in some jurisdictions. And we accept these powers because we believe they protect us. Because the alternative, anarchy, lawlessness, the absence of centralized authority, seems worse. The Aegis is the ancient symbol of this political bargain. And every time we justify state power, every time we accept limits on our freedom in exchange for security, we're essentially accepting the logic of the Aegis, the problem of who gets protected. But here's where the Aegis analogy reveals a fundamental problem with modern political systems. Not everyone receives equal protection. Just as Medusa herself wasn't protected, she was violated, transformed, and ultimately killed. Modern states often fail to protect the most vulnerable members of society. Marginalized communities receive less police protection while simultaneously being subject to more police violence. Poor neighborhoods have fewer resources while paying proportionally more in taxes. Immigrants, minorities, the disabled, those who most need the protection that the social contract promises often receive at least. The Aegis, bearing the face of a victimized woman, forces us to confront this uncomfortable truth. The symbol of protection is powered by someone who wasn't protected. And that's not just ancient history. That's a continuing reality in modern political systems. When we invoke security and order and protection, we need to ask, whose security? Whose order? Protection for whom? And at whose expense? The Aegis won't let us pretend these questions have easy answers. Conclusion: the Aegis is political mirror. What we've discovered is that the Aegis isn't just an ancient symbol. It's a mirror reflecting fundamental tensions in political organization itself. The need for protection versus the violence required to provide it. The concentration of power versus the risk of tyranny. The promise of universal safety versus the reality of selective application. Every political system grapples with these tensions. And the Aegis, that ancient shield bearing a victim's face, captures them with an honesty that modern political rhetoric often lacks. We prefer to pretend that order arises naturally, that protection is gentle, that authority is legitimate through reason alone. The Aegis says, no, order is maintained through power. Protection requires terror. Authority rests on violence. And if we're going to build just societies, we need to start by acknowledging that truth, not hiding from it. We've covered a lot of ground. The mythology, the symbolism, the cultural impact, the political implications. But now I want to get personal. Because the Aegis isn't just an abstract symbol. It's a story that asks us to examine our own relationships with power, protection, and vulnerability. So let's talk about what the Aegis means on a human level. What it can teach us about living in a world where safety is never guaranteed, where power is always complicated, where protection comes at a cost. Facing your own Gorgons. We all have Gorgons in our lives. Things we're afraid to look at directly. Truths about ourselves or our world that we avoid because confronting them feels like it would turn us to stone, freeze us with fear or shame or despair. Maybe it's trauma from your past. Maybe it's a difficult relationship you need to address. Maybe it's an uncomfortable truth about your privilege or your participation in systems that harm others. Maybe it's facing your own mortality, your own limitations, your own capacity for cruelty. These are our Gorgons. And like the mythological Gorgon, looking at them directly feels impossible. We fear we'll be destroyed by the encounter. But the Aegis myth suggests something interesting. These Gorgons, these terrifying truths, can become sources of protection once confronted. Perseus defeated Medusa by looking at her reflection rather than directly. He found a way to see what he needed to see without being destroyed. And then, controversially, problematically, he used her power for his own purposes. There's a lesson here about how we confront difficult truths. We don't always have to face them head-on in ways that overwhelm us. We can approach them obliquely, through therapy, through art, through stories, through conversations with trusted others. We can look at the reflection before we look at the thing itself. And once we've confronted these truths, once we've integrated them, they can become sources of strength. The trauma you've processed can help you empathize with others. The difficult truth you've acknowledged can inform wiser choices. The limitation you've accepted can free you from destructive striving. Your Gorgons can become your Aegis. But, and this is important, we have to be careful not to weaponize our trauma the way the gods weaponized Medusa. There's a difference between finding strength in what you've survived and using your suffering as a justification to harm others. Processing trauma should make you more compassionate, not more destructive. Confronting difficult truths should lead to growth, not to cynicism or cruelty. Medusa didn't choose to become a weapon. Don't make that choice either. The illusion of safety. The Aegis also teaches us something about the nature of security itself. We spend so much of our lives pursuing safety. Financial security, physical security, emotional security. We build walls, literal and metaphorical. We take out insurance policies. We avoid risks. We try to control as many variables as possible. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to be safe. It's human. It's natural. But the Aegis reminds us that absolute security is an illusion. Even Zeus, with the most powerful protective artifact in existence, faced threats. Even divine protection has limits. The Aegis could terrify enemies, could turn them to stone, could shake the heavens themselves. But it couldn't prevent the challenges Zeus faced throughout the myths. It couldn't stop his children from rebelling, couldn't end all threats to his authority, couldn't make him invulnerable in every sense. Protection is relative. Security is provisional. And I think there's something liberating in accepting that. Because if you're chasing perfect security, you'll never arrive. There will always be one more precaution to take, one more risk to eliminate, one more boundary to establish. You'll spend your whole life building walls instead of living. But if you can accept that safety is always partial, always limited, always requiring vigilance, then you can stop chasing the impossible and instead focus on the possible. You can take reasonable precautions while still engaging with life. You can protect yourself without hiding from the world. You can carry your own Aegis, your boundaries, your defenses, your capacity for self-protection, without letting it define your entire existence. The responsibility of power. If you have any form of power, and most of us do, in various contexts, the Aegis asks you to examine how you use it. Are you protecting the vulnerable, or are you using the vulnerable to maintain your own position? Are you wielding your power consciously and ethically, or are you hiding behind justifications and rationalizations? Are you willing to acknowledge the cost of your protection, or do you pretend it's free? Parents have power over children. Employers have power over employees. Teachers have power over students. Those with economic advantages have power in the marketplace. Those with social privileges have power in public spaces. And all of us, when we have power, face the temptation to use it in ways that benefit us at others' expense. The Aegis, with Medusa's face upon it, is a reminder of what happens when power is abused, when the strong exploit the weak, when those who should protect instead harm. If you find yourself in a position of power, even small, everyday power, ask yourself, am I using this power to genuinely protect and serve, or am I using it to maintain my own position? Am I Zeus, wielding the Aegis to maintain cosmic order? Or am I the one who violated Medusa in the temple? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're necessary, because power without accountability, protection without justice, authority without compassion, these inevitably lead to the kind of tragedy that Medusa represents. And none of us want to be the person whose protection comes at the cost of others' suffering. Finding meaning in tragedy. Medusa's story is tragic. There's no way around that. She was victimized, transformed, hunted, and killed. Her image was then used without her consent to protect the same divine order that failed to protect her. It's unjust. It's cruel. It's a reminder that life isn't fair, that suffering isn't always meaningful, that bad things happen to people who don't deserve them. And yet, her image endures. Thousands of years later, we're still talking about her, still grappling with her story, still finding meaning in her tragedy. Does that redeem what happened to her? No, of course not. But it does suggest that even from tragedy, even from injustice, meaning can emerge. Not meaning that justifies the tragedy. Nothing could justify what happened to Medusa. But meaning that acknowledges it, that learns from it, that ensures it's not forgotten. In our own lives, we all face tragedies. Losses, injustices, experiences that leave us transformed in ways we never chose. The Aegis myth doesn't promise that these experiences will make sense, or that they happen for a reason, or that they'll make you stronger. But it does suggest that even from tragedy, something can be built. Even from suffering, purpose can be found. Not because the suffering was good or necessary, but because humans are meaning-making creatures who find ways to live with and through their pain. Medusa's face on the Aegis is a testament to that human capacity. The transformation of tragedy into symbol, of victimization into warning, of suffering into story. We can't always prevent bad things from happening. We can't always get justice for the wrongs done to us or others. But we can ensure those experiences aren't erased. We can tell the stories. We can create meaning from the fragments of our broken experiences. We can, in a sense, make our own Aegis, not by weaponizing our trauma, but by integrating it into our understanding of the world, by letting it inform our compassion, by using our survival to help others survive. The both/and of existence. Finally, the Aegis teaches us to hold contradictions. It's protective and terrifying. It represents order and injustice. It's necessary and cruel. It empowers and exploits. And that both/and quality, that refusal to be simple, is perhaps Aegis's most important teaching. Life doesn't come in neat categories. Morality isn't black and white. People and systems and symbols can be multiple things at once. You can be strong and vulnerable, protected and exposed, safe and afraid. You can recognize that protection is necessary while acknowledging that it comes at a cost. You can value order while questioning authority. You can carry your own defenses while remaining open to connection. The Aegis doesn't resolve these contradictions. It holds them. It forces us to acknowledge that complexity, that both/and nature of existence. And that's uncomfortable. Humans like clarity. We like simple answers. We like to know whether something is good or bad, helpful or harmful, protective or destructive. But the Aegis says, sometimes it's all of those things. Sometimes protection requires violence. Sometimes justice coexists with injustice. Sometimes the symbol of safety bears the face of someone who wasn't safe. Learning to hold those contradictions, to see both the protection and the cost, both the necessity and the tragedy, that's wisdom. That's what the Aegis has been teaching for thousands of years. And I'm still teaching it today. We've journeyed deep into the mythology, symbolism, and meaning of the Aegis. From its creation in the fires of the Titanomachy to its modern appearances in video games and military systems. From Medusa's tragic transformation to the philosophical questions about power and protection that the myth raises. But now we need to bring it all together. What have we learned? What does the Aegis ultimately mean? And why does this ancient symbol still matter in our modern world? The Aegis as eternal question. I think the Aegis endures because it asks a question that every generation must answer for itself. What price are we willing to pay for safety? The ancient Greeks faced this question when building their city-states, when establishing laws, when going to war. They needed protection from external enemies, from internal chaos, from the natural world's dangers. And to get that protection, they granted enormous power to their institutions, to kings, to priests, to democratic assemblies. They built walls. They trained soldiers. They created systems of justice that could imprison or execute. They carried shields bearing the Gorgonian, reminding everyone that civilization's order was maintained through the capacity for violence. We face the same question today. In our democracies, in our security systems, in our international relations, in our personal lives. How much freedom will we sacrifice for security? How much power will we grant to authorities who promise to protect us? How much violence will we accept in the name of order? The Aegis doesn't answer these questions. It just forces us to confront them, to acknowledge that protection isn't free, that safety requires trade-offs, that every shield casts a shadow. The tragedy we carry. The Aegis also reminds us of a darker truth, that our protection often comes at someone else's expense. Medusa's face on the shield is a permanent reminder of this. Every victory won with the Aegis, every threat deterred, every battle avoided. All of it is made possible by a victim's weaponized image. And that's still true today. Our economic security often depends on exploited labor somewhere else in the world. Our national security often comes at the cost of innocent lives in other countries. Our personal comfort often relies on systems that harm marginalized communities. We don't like to think about this. We prefer to imagine that our safety is purely defensive, that our protection harms no one, that we're simply prudent rather than complicit. But the Aegis won't let us hide from the truth. It shows us the face of the victim, staring back at us, asking, "Do you see me? Do you acknowledge what your protection costs?" And if we have any moral courage, we must answer, "Yes, I see you, and I will not pretend otherwise." This doesn't mean we can or should abandon all protection. We can't live without boundaries, without defenses, without systems that maintain order. But we can acknowledge the cost. We can work to minimize it. We can ensure that protection doesn't become exploitation, that security doesn't become tyranny, that order doesn't become oppression. We can carry the Aegis consciously, ethically, with full awareness of what it represents. The power of symbols. What strikes me most about the Aegis is how a symbol created thousands of years ago can still speak so powerfully to modern concerns. The Greeks didn't have nuclear weapons or surveillance states or global supply chains. But they understood, at a fundamental level, the tensions between power and justice, between protection and violence, between order and freedom. And they encoded that understanding in a symbol, a divine shield bearing a victim's face. That symbol has survived empire after empire, cultural shift after cultural shift, technological revolution after technological revolution. Because the questions it asks are eternal. Because the tensions it represents are fundamental to human society. Because the truth it reveals, that protection comes at a cost, is a truth every generation needs to hear. This is the power of mythology. Not just entertainment, not just ancient superstition, but a repository of human wisdom distilled into stories and symbols that transcend their original context. When we engage with myths like the Aegis, we're not just learning about ancient Greece. We're learning about ourselves, about our own fears and desires, our own contradictions and complexities, our own struggles to create meaning in an uncertain world. The Aegis is a mirror, and what we see in it reveals as much about us as about the ancient Greeks who created it. Carrying your own Aegis. So what do you do with all this knowledge? How do you live with the understanding that protection requires power, that safety demands vigilance, that order rests on violence? I think you carry your own Aegis consciously. You develop your boundaries, your defenses, your capacity for self-protection. But you do so with awareness of what those defenses mean and what they cost. You protect yourself without weaponizing your pain against others. You maintain your boundaries without dehumanizing those outside them. You defend your values without demonizing those who disagree. You seek safety without demanding it at others' expense. This is hard, maybe impossible to do perfectly, but the attempt matters. Because the alternative, wielding power unconsciously, seeking protection without acknowledging its cost, maintaining order through unexamined violence, that path leads to becoming the gods who failed Medusa, to create victims in the name of safety, to build empires on foundations of suffering. The Aegis, bearing Medusa's face, is a warning against that path. It says, see what you're doing. Acknowledge who pays the price. Don't look away. And if we can heed that warning, if we can wield our own power with humility and awareness, then maybe we can create forms of protection that are more just, more compassionate, more worthy of the responsibilities we carry. The final lesson. There's one more thing the Aegis teaches us, and it's perhaps the most important lesson of all. Some truths must be approached indirectly. Remember how Perseus defeated Medusa. He didn't look at her directly. That would have turned him to stone. Instead, he looked at her reflection in his polished shield. He saw what he needed to see without being destroyed by the encounter. This is what mythology does. It allows us to confront difficult truths about power, about violence, about our own complicity in systems of harm, at one remove, through the safety of story. We can look at the Aegis, see Medusa's face upon it, and grapple with the ethical complexities of protection without being paralyzed by those complexities. We can engage with the myth, learn from it, integrate its lessons, and then return to our lives with deeper understanding. The shield becomes a mirror, a lens becomes a teaching tool, and that's the ultimate power of the Aegis. Not its ability to turn enemies to stone, but its ability to turn our attention to truths we'd rather avoid, gently, through symbol and story, in ways that transform rather than destroy us. Final thoughts. The Aegis is more than a mythological artifact. It's a symbol that encapsulates fundamental tensions in human existence: protection and violence, order and injustice, power and responsibility. For thousands of years, humans have looked at the Aegis, at Medusa's face staring back from Zeus's shield or Athena's breastplate, and grappled with what it means. And we're still grappling with it today, still asking the same questions, still confronting the same contradictions, still trying to figure out how to create safety without exploitation, order without tyranny, protection without cruelty. The ancient Greeks didn't solve these problems. Neither have we, but they gave us a symbol that keeps the questions alive, that forces each generation to confront them anew, that refuses to let us hide from difficult truths behind comforting illusions. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's what mythology is supposed to do, not provide answers, but ensure we keep asking the right questions. The Aegis endures not because it resolved the tensions it represents, but because it captured them so perfectly that 3,000 years later, we still recognize ourselves in its polished surface. We still see Medusa's face staring back, and we still have to decide, what are we willing to see? What are we willing to acknowledge? What price are we willing to pay for the protection we seek? These are your questions now. Aegis has presented them. The myth has done its work. How you answer is up to you. Thank you for taking this journey with me through the mythology, symbolism, and meaning of the Aegis. This has been one of the most complex and fascinating topics I've ever explored. If you made it all the way to the end, seriously, thank you. This was a deep dive, and your attention and engagement mean everything. If this video resonated with you, if you found yourself thinking differently about power, protection, or ancient mythology, please hit that like button. It helps other people find this content, and it tells me that this kind of in-depth exploration is valuable. And if you want more content like this, deep dives into mythology, philosophy, and the stories that have shaped human civilization, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because we're building something special here. A community of people who understand that these ancient stories aren't just history. They're living wisdom that speaks to our modern struggles. Drop a comment below and let me know, what's your relationship with Aegis now? Has this changed how you think about protection and power? What other mythological symbols should we explore in this depth? Remember, the Aegis teaches us to look at difficult truths without being destroyed by them, to hold complexity without resolving it into false simplicity, to acknowledge the cost of protection while still valuing safety. Carry that lesson with you. Build your own Aegis, your boundaries, your defenses, your capacity for self-protection. But do so consciously, ethically, with full awareness of what it means and what it costs. And never forget Medusa's face staring back from the shield. Never forget that protection often comes at someone's expense. Never stop asking, whose safety? At what cost? And is there a better way? These are the questions that matter. These are the questions that Aegis has been asking for 3,000 years. And now I'm asking them to. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, keep engaging with the stories that make us human. This has been a journey into the Aegis, the divine shield that changed mythology forever. Thank you for walking with me.